introduce the panel right quick, and then we're going to launch right into our conversation. My name is Michele Norris. I work here in this building. I'm a special correspondent for NPR, and I'll serve as your moderator this evening. To my direct right is Tom Krattenmaker. He's a member of the D.C. Bar, and as you saw, he was a law clerk to Justice Harlan, and his role in the case was crucial because he pointed out a point of law that wound up being the hinge that turned this case. Subsequent to his clerkship, he had 3 legal careers as a law school professor and dean, as a lawyer for U.S. government agencies, and as counsel to various D.C. law firms. He is now retired from all 3 of those roles, and he joins us this evening. Thank you very much for being here. And next to Tom Krattenmaker is Eugene Robinson. Eugene Robinson is a columnist. If you live here in Washington, D.C., and I assume most of you do, you see his name in the paper quite regularly. He's a columnist for the Washington Post. You also see him on television. He's a commentator for MSNBC. He has a twice-weekly column on the Post op-ed page. It was launched in February 2005, and as a former Postie myself, I'm going to brag on him for a minute. When he began his column, it was, within a year, it was syndicated to more than 130 newspapers. That's really astonishing. It was the fastest, am I right? It was the fastest growing column in the newspaper.
It was fast.
When he talks, people listen. And when he writes,
I am the greatest of all time.
Perfect setup.
You write like a butterfly.
Right. Sting like a bee.
And sting like a bee, yes.
And edit like a bee. Yeah.
And in 2009, he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. He's a native of Orangeburg, South Carolina. I want to begin with you, Tom, because we saw your role there, and I want to talk a little bit about the finding that the court had, that there was this precedent, really, with Jehovah's Witnesses who, if called to participate in a holy war of some kind, that under law they could file as conscientious objectors. How did you find that? Were you aware of that, or were you looking at that point for precedent?
People my age knew more about draft law than we did about anything else in this life. I was born in 1943, and forgive me if there are a lot of Lyndon Johnson fans out there. I took it very personally. That man tried to kill me, and so I read a lot of draft law, so that man wasn't able to do it. I'll lay that personal stuff aside. The central problem, I hope it came out okay in the film, in the Ali case, wasn't really whether he had religious views. He did. And as the government conceded eventually, it wasn't whether he was sincere or not. It's whether he was a conscientious objector in the way Congress had envisioned it when they wrote the statute, which means you're opposed to participation in all wars. And the example we all have in mind are the Quakers. And certainly those of us that went to Quaker schools think that. I'm not a Quaker myself, but... or was he rather what was then called a selective CO? That is, somebody who had moral, maybe even religious objections to particular wars, but not to all wars. Because the court, just earlier that term, had firmly said selective conscientious objection does not get you an exemption. And that's why the Jehovah's Witness case was so important. That had come up during the time of the, sort of near the end of the Korean War, and I'm certainly not an expert in that religious doctrine, but as it was portrayed in 1956 anyway, Jehovah's Witnesses very firmly said they were conscientious objectors, but they also very firmly said, if summoned by Allah, we'll go to war. And what the Supreme Court said, reversing the lower courts, was they're talking about, I'm probably just repeating myself here in the film, a theocratic war, not what Justice Clark called a bombs and bullets, real person-to-person war. And the fact that you believe that in some other life you may be summoned by your God to fight a battle or to blow a horn and have the walls come tumbling down doesn't mean that you're not a complete conscientious objector.
So when you raise this point...
Is that helpful responsive to your
it
question?
Does. Yeah. It is, very much so. And
Right.
so when you raise this point with Justice Harlan,
Right.
was he open to it? Did you spar a little bit with
Oh,
him?
he sparred a lot. Yes, of course. But of course he was open to it too. I mean, this was I could spend an hour talking about what a wonderful and interesting fellow he was, but if nothing else, he was even though he was then the age that I am now, he still had an open mind and a great capacity for growth. Frankly, I think that here we come on issues of how we remember those times. In 1971. Opposition to the Vietnam War had become fairly widespread, but when Ali refused to submit to induction in 1966, the war was not unpopular.
That period was very
in the
important.
national press,
the fulcrum term.
yeah,
right.
the national press, the Nation of Islam was a bunch of thugs. Or uncouth black people. That's not right, but that's the way they were being portrayed nationally. And it's not like Supreme Court justices don't read the papers. So honestly, one of the things that was helpful about the Jehovah's Witness case was they were perceived, many black people are Jehovah's Witnesses, but they were perceived as kind of a white religious group. And so I think one of the things that Justice Harlan wrestled with is, if we say one thing for the Nation of Islam and another for Jehovah's Witnesses, are we speaking with a kind of a racially forked tongue here? And this is the fellow who's the grandson of Justice Harlan, who descended in Plessy and Ferguson. This is the fellow whose grandfather spoke out against all forms of racial segregation in the 19th century, and was a friend, by the way, of Cassius Marcellus Clay, the man who freed all his slaves.
I love
that. This whole story can be told through the state of Kentucky, and we can get into that if you want to.
I just have one question, which is that so in the film you say, so then we had a problem, right?
Yeah.
So, this inconvenient, thing about the law and the meant that the case had to be effectively decided in favor of Muhammad Ali. That would have made it inconvenient because you couldn't, the whole Nation of Islam would be exempt. So is that how the court worked, right? It's like, okay, so now we got to find some way to decide the case.
Got a do-over.
Yeah,
right? We got to decide the case this way, but we got to find some very narrow,
I think a little bit that's what was going on, but of course I can't speak for what's in the mind of the other people. But yes, I mentioned that in the film because I think that's what was going on. They really had two problems. I like Bill Siegel, who produced this film, but he didn't put enough of me in it. When they're 4-4, one problem they have is that means the judgment below gets affirmed and no opinion is written. So the court would have just announced the conviction is affirmed. Harlan loses, even though he's changed his mind.
Right.
All the good guys, as I think of it, I thought it was the right result, lose. But the other problem is, if Harlan's view was going to prevail, then what you mentioned, that there's the question of we're going to fight the war in Vietnam, except that every black man in America join the Nation of Islam, get out. Now, as one of my black professor friends said, that means you got to stop smoking and drinking. To me, that would be a small price to pay. So, I mean, sort of what would this mean for the war machine? There's no question that those thoughts were in people's minds. Chief Justice Berger said to one of his law clerks when Harlan's memo to the conference came around, John Harlan has become an apologist for the black Muslims. And he was the last person to change his vote. It was going to be 7-1, and at the last minute he said, well, I'll just make it unanimous. So they had these two kinds of dilemmas, and I'm sure that Justice Stewart was a bit of a white knight there, riding in on his charger. Maybe in this form I shouldn't call him a white knight. He was a salvation in that he said, look, we can get where Harlan's going without having to write something that takes the black Muslim doctrine as seriously as Harlan did.
The Supreme Court is an incredibly cloistered body. And Muhammad Ali was this larger-than-life figure. His personality, Eugene, I assume, played a significant role in the court's examination of this, the close examination, and their willingness then to backtrack.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly pointed out in the film that the court felt it couldn't dodge this case, right, because it was Muhammad Ali, and so you talk about larger than life. I think it.
They wanted to. If this case had been about, I'll just make up a name, Joe Smith, it never would have been heard. That was pretty much due to Justice Brennan. He had argued very vociferously that Clay, in the meantime, had become such an important public figure that they had to accept the case.
And yet he wasn't necessarily spending all that time in the boxing ring. Help us understand a little bit more about his time out delivering speeches, speaking to people in these one-on-one encounters that he had. If you actually read about him at that time, he never brushed anybody off. Anybody who approached him in a restaurant, in an airport.
He liked to talk. And to engage with people. But he, as his I guess second wife said, he had to earn a living, and so it was fascinating to me to see the evolution of him as a public speaker, and how awful he was at the beginning, and how he got better at it, and it's I guess the case of a very smart, charismatic man who just had to kind of figure out how to do that.
I wonder if he actually got better at it, or if he got more comfortable with the idea that people were uncomfortable listening to him. Because he actually was a pretty strong speaker.
Well, yeah, that's true, except in the sense of keeping the audience with you, so they actually hear what you have to say. And I think at the beginning he just turned audiences off, and at the beginning, and then what was kind of the point? I mean, he was a guy who didn't want to just stand up there and speak for the check, right? He had something he wanted to communicate, and I think it was just a matter of how best to communicate, and that involved keeping the audience with you.
How did Dr. King view Muhammad Ali? I mean, there was interesting footage. You noticed when he was standing next to Muhammad Ali, and if you read the body language of all the clergy that were behind him, they're clearly uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, it was. I think, I'm not sure it ever progressed much beyond a certain wariness, a certain reluctance to entirely and fully embrace. Although, as you heard in that clip from with Dr. King said, whatever you think of his religion, you have to admire his courage, and clearly there was it evolved. That relationship evolved far from where it was at the beginning, which was essentially he's this alien religion and these crazy Nation of Islam people who had a completely different idea about life than Dr. King did, and I don't think they ever. I don't think it was ever close, because that was still a big divide. Dr. King's approach versus the Nation of Islam approach, which Muhammad Ali,
Carmichael and others.
Muhammad Ali, to the end.
One thought I have about that, and you would know better about this than I. Don't really know as much about Dr. King as I would like to, but he, in his public persona, moved more and more. I'm thinking about the Poor People's Campaign as well as the opposition to the war. Of course, he was always a very religious man and a real Christian. And so I think at the beginning we had a Christian man looking at a blunt-spoken, not very well-educated Muslim man. And then as King's thoughts moved more and more in the direction of stressing peace and nonviolence, he was always a nonviolent person, but as he started coming to see the war as immoral, I think that would have drawn him closer to Ali.
I think that's a great point, and I think also both of them became more internationalist in their outlook, and I think that those movements coincided.
That's a really good point.
And you also had a war that was playing out on television screens in people's living rooms every single night. I wonder what the role of the press was in helping people understand who Muhammad Ali was in real time there, both in terms of what was being broadcast into people's homes, but also in the news reporters, both sports reporters and news reporters who were following him. I thought it was interesting that the documentary began with this very pugilistic interview, and I wish in some ways that they'd gone back to that, because I wanted to know how he handled himself when he faced such aggressive
But there was this sort of almost open hostility, right, at the beginning, and clearly it evolved into something else. Now, part of that was he was a great boxer, and what sports writer could resist his talent and his achievement in the ring, his audacity. He had so many attractive qualities as a sports figure, and also his eloquence, which I think evolved as well. It too was harder edged at the beginning, or certainly came off that way. Perhaps everybody just kind of got used to the, I am the greatest of all time. That thing that he did, and so it maybe it just seemed less hard edged, or maybe it actually did have a bit of a softer edge as his career advanced.
I think it's true that as you went on, he appeared to be less egocentric. I was kind of sorry that Bill cut out, but of course, I mean, when he beat Liston, he was so excited. But if you watch the HBO film, that's a fictionalized version of the court case there, they begin with him running around the ring and the things he's saying after Liston, they're all about himself. And of course, at the end, he's not talking that way. I'm not a member of the press, although I'm a card-carrying believer in the First Amendment. I think mostly what the American press did was to vilify and belittle Muhammad Ali. I think the director of this film found the one guy that didn't do that, and that was Robert Lipsyte, who was writing for the New York Times, which refused to call him Muhammad Ali for 3 years.
That was the other thing I was going to bring up.
The best example of a sympathetic person you could
and I love that he found
was
his
writing
own
for a
copy.
publication that wouldn't allow the man to change his name.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Howard Cosell, who's kind of taken out of this one.
Exactly, but Cosell was a major figure in translating Muhammad Ali to the nation.
There's a wonderful
and was
book
a convert
about
because he was very caustic with him in the beginning, and they later sparred, and you could see that there was a friendly, mutual respect between them and almost a friendship.
Yeah, part of the
But it didn't start there.
Part of the story that's not in here is the Cosell didn't pick up as much on his draft resistance as he did on. I mean, Howard Cosell was a lawyer. What he picked up on was how can these boxing commissions be refusing to license him when his conviction hasn't been affirmed? Sort of a legal point of view, and he was instrumental in helping to push the idea that Jerry Quarry said. That if you weren't put in jail and your conviction hasn't been affirmed, you should be allowed to practice your profession. Cosell did more about that. There is a book, speaking of the Washington Post, former writer for the Post, the sports section, Dave Kindred, has a book called Sound and Fury, which is a dual biography of Cosell and Ali. And I think it's, I shouldn't say that, I think it's extremely well done. He's also very nice to me in the book, but even leaving those pages out, I think it's well done.
So how many people in the audience knew that Muhammad Ali had been on Broadway?
Oh, I did not.
Okay, gold star for the three of you.
I did.
But wasn't that amazing?
Wasn't that great?
That was insane.
Yes.
It was insane. It was
Have you got a
crazy.
wig like that? Can we put you in a wig like that?
I did not only do I not have a wig like that, I could never grow a fro like that. I could never get that
I think
big.
more than a few people in this room tonight are going to go home and be on Google trying to find the rest of that production. Tom, you had talked about what Chief Justice Brennan had to say in close quarters about what was going on. I'm wondering about Thurgood Marshall.
Oh, yes.
And whether or not he ever talked about the unusual position that he found himself in,
So
having
am
to
I.
recuse himself.
Coming down here tonight, I was wondering, I said, now, how would Justice Marshall have voted in this case. And you say, well, Tom, why are you puzzled? He always stood up for individual rights. He was really quite an outspoken champion on the court of individual rights. But in the HBO film, they have Marshall, before he leaves the room, say, I don't like this guy, Clay. I'm an integrationist. Marshall had spent his entire... Marshall brought Brown against Board of Education and several cases leading up to it. Marshall would not have liked the message to the black man from Elijah Muhammad. Would not have liked it one bit.
And had his life threatened on more than one occasion. Trying to escape people who were pursuing him in the dead of night.
He was a kind man, the greatest storyteller I ever met in my life. And so to me, it's an enigma as to what he would have done. For everybody, the film might have gone over that too fast. Of course, there are 9 people on the court, but only 8 participated in this case because Justice Marshall had been the Solicitor General when Clay was tried and convicted, and the firm and the lawyers who were representing Clay in the Supreme Court included some of the top lawyers at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which had been Thurgood Marshall's virtual creation. So we need to find. I'll do it. We'll go find a couple of his former clerks and see if they have some insights into it.
But I think
check back with us.
It would have been a really hard case for him. A really hard case.
No, I think that's basically right, and I think that Marshall's views, as we impute them to him, probably track with the views of that generation, really, of African Americans, and I just can't help but think of my own father's views about Muhammad Ali over time through the years, and he was kind of hostile to him at first, like this kid, and the whole Islam thing he thought was weird, and he liked boxing, because everybody liked boxing from that generation. It was a really big deal, and it was only gradually over time, again with his talent and skill, but also just by being around, I think, longer, and also the way society and our views of so many things changed in that period from, like 1964 to 1971
and yet
or
his
whatever.
convictions remain the same.
Right.
Is that how he won many people over? Because he did not waver.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, he kind of, but he certainly my father's view of him softened, and he became a fan. But it took a while. It took probably a little past 71, actually.
Probably to some extent, the fact that the Supreme Court reversed his conviction. People think, the Supreme Court says that what he did was right.
And of course, and my father was
exactly
a World War II veteran who,
like mine, one more thought about Justice Marshall. You remember that, for Justice Douglas, this was a really easy case, because Justice Douglas believed you could be a selective conscientious objector. He took the position that if you were morally, conscientiously, religiously opposed to this war, for example, Vietnam, even though you would have fought another war like World War II, you were exempt. Marshall might have taken that view if he'd had to. And so, but as I said, the court as a body had decided just earlier in the term that wasn't the case, that they weren't going to read the law that way. So.
Why do we have a hard time remembering Muhammad Ali and his history in full?
I think there are a couple of reasons. One, there were so many phases of his, so many different Muhammad. First, there was a Cassius Clay, and then there was the young, the Cassius Clay who won the title, and then there was the young Muhammad Ali, and then there was Muhammad Ali who wasn't, who was the conscientious objector, and threatened with jail, and there was then the Muhammad Ali who came back and who fought the Rumble in the Jungle and the Thriller in Manila and all those great fights that we remember, and then there was the aging Muhammad Ali as he developed his Parkinson's, so there's so many of him that I think it's hard to you can kind of take your pick in a way. That's one reason. The other reason is I think he's a particularly difficult figure to get to know, to really penetrate. And as excellent as that film was, and as excellent as a number of attempts have been to get to the heart of the man, I'm always left feeling a bit unsatisfied that I don't really know him at the kernel and core. Right, there's something that he puts up, and you get to know that very well, and that's not false. It's not untrue at all, but it's not the whole story. And maybe I'd like to spend more time with his brother or something. And
that's an interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
I've read a lot about him because of my involvement in the case. I'd like to say I think the 2 points you just made are profound. I think that's some of the most thoughtful stuff I've ever heard said about Ali. And I agree with you. I know when I read Dave Kindred's book, I just called him up and I said, okay, so why did he do it? After reading the book and everything, okay, so why was he a CO? The other little thing I would add is that I always tell friends of mine who might watch the documentary, I say, if you don't do anything else, just watch the first minute and a half. That juxtaposition of David Susskind, the Larry King of television in the 1960s, for those of you that don't know, a very widely known and admired left-leaning figure. Him with that view, and George W. Bush with completely the opposite view. Presenting there, that is the story of Muhammad Ali, at least in the eyes of white America. Other people would have to speak to.
And so, was he the same Muhammad Ali? And the country just changed, that's one reading of it. And that's a lot of it, I think.
I thought it was interesting that the filmmaker helped us understand the role of the women in his life. I appreciated hearing from his second wife. And that perhaps is a window, or at least a peek behind that facade, that she, for someone who had so much bombast, that he respected her. I mean, she was the one that when he went to the corner of that ring,
in his face
she said,
say,
listen, you need to make some money.
Right. You could see that.
I'm sorry the current wife didn't talk in the film, because I know there's a very close relationship there, and he's really not in a position to be talking about himself anymore because it's so hard for him to speak. And
Can
I
I
don't
ask
know why.
about that? And this is a question it is asked completely out of respect, but I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons that we've had a hard time understanding him, because there is a point in life as you get older where you go through a period of disinhibition, where you're more willing to tell your stories, and as he enters that period of life, he's unable to tell the story.
No, I think it's entirely the Parkinson's disease. He really just have you saw. It's awfully quick right there, but if you noticed, he's on television 10 days after 9/11 to say Islam is peaceful. We are not terrorists, and he can barely get it out.
But if you saw that 60 Minutes piece. Do you remember? There's this wonderful. Does anyone remember this? There's this wonderful 60 Minutes piece with Ed Bradley, rest his soul, and Muhammad Ali is nodding as if he's falling asleep.
Oh well, I missed that.
But he's playing possum with him. Oh. And so he totally, and then he does. Carleen, you remember seeing that he grabs his hand or something? He does something that lets him know, because they start talking over him. Like he's asleep.
That's my
they're ignoring him.
He's still got the mental faculties.
And then he shows them.
He just
I'm paying
he has trouble with the vocal cords
now.
If you've never been to the museum in Louisville, Kentucky, I encourage you, if you're in Louisville, to get there. His foundation and the work that is done through that foundation is very interesting, and I wonder what role the foundation plays in preserving his memory, and again, as we've been talking about, his story in full.
You may know more about the foundation itself than I do. I've been to the museum, and which is a kind of wonderful tribute to him and to his legacy. I kind of knew that there had been this sort of group of Louisville backers, but to me, seeing the museum in Louisville is a fairly conservative city, always struck me as a bit of an irony, at least. But it's a city that's certainly very proud of him.
Are there things in this film that resonate today in terms of issues? I mean, it's a fairly obvious question, but where do you see those things and those tensions with regard to religious freedom and the ability to stand your ground, even when that position is extremely unpopular and you have something to lose?
Well, I'd suggest two things. One of the things that I learned from being somewhat involved in this project is, I had not known this, what an extraordinary hero this man is around the world. And I think one of the things that resonates from this film, it's partly just showing you when he's a young man in Ghana and Nigeria and in Egypt. But this may be the best known American in the world, or the most beloved American in the world. Right or wrong, it's incredible. And I think that we have to ask ourselves, why is this the case? And I think it's because he was preaching a message of inclusion and peace, and a man who stood up for principle. And so he turned out to be a very good representation of what we think are fundamental American values, and a good representation of that in Asia, in the Middle East, in China, and most importantly in Africa.
And inclusion and peace, but it's interesting because for a time when people ask, Elijah Muhammad preached that all white people were the devil, and he would say, well, that's, I believe that. Right, but then later in life he says, well, that was during that white devil period.
Yeah, exactly.
Fortunately,
Bill left in the film that one little clip where he says, you were the devil back then.
Used to be a devil back then.
Exactly, but we all know he sort of passed through that, which just brought him to where Malcolm X was, when Malcolm X. And the other thing I would mention is your point about I think another thing that should resonate for all of us in the film is religious freedom and religious tolerance.
Well, exactly.
I mean, this is, how many countries in the world in 1971, if their leader was saying we're at war with somebody else, would take somebody from a tiny little religious minority and say, well, you don't have to participate because you've got a conscientious objection. I know it's not a perfect country, folks, but it's incredible. My own view is the First Amendment is the most civilized political act in the recorded history of mankind. And I mean the whole First Amendment, speech, debate, everything. But I think that something that might resonate there in the film is that it's not just a person who stood up for his beliefs, but that all these, eventually the power structure said, yeah, that's right, we should honor those.
I think that. No, I think that. I think that's absolutely right. To me, the power of religion, and specifically the otherness of Islam in this society, I think has clear echoes today. And as kind of pointed out, if you consider Orthodox Islam and Nation of Islam to be two flavors of Islam, perhaps their position has switched in terms of their acceptability here, or their or the way that or the extent to which people feel they are and can be included in society. Not in the legal and constitutional sense, although there are those who would just as soon have change the First Amendment to just deal with these Muslims, but not so much in that sense, but in the sense of how society kind of feels about and reacts to Islam. I think that's very clearly still with us, and in many senses, in a more poisonous way than it was then.
The museum and the foundation, they run something, they run a website, and on that website there is something called I Am Muhammad Ali, and they expected that only a handful of people would tell their Muhammad Ali stories. Remember that Pantene commercial where, was it Pantene, where it just kept splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting, and it just kept going and going and going, and they now have thousands and thousands of people from all over the world who upload these videos and tell their Muhammad Ali story, and they all end with I Am Muhammad Ali. And I wanted to end the evening with asking both of you if you had a particular story, a moment, a memory of Muhammad Ali that you wanted to share this evening.
I'll try to do this short. I don't have a personal, my personal moment is once removed, and I spent 34 years at the Washington Post and did a whole bunch of different jobs, and I think I've done maybe 4 or 5 sports stories in that time. 2 of them were boxing stories. One, I got assigned to cover a heavyweight boxing match when I was London correspondent, and I missed, because George Solomon, the sports editor, didn't want to send somebody all the way to London to cover this title fight. I missed the knockout punch and had to buy the Scottish boxing writer who was sitting next to me. I had to buy him several rounds later on in exchange for describing the punch to me so I could file my story. So but that's not the story. That was one of the boxing stories. The other boxing story I did was a profile of a boxer in Cuba who actually was demonstrably a greater amateur heavyweight boxer than Muhammad Ali, and it was a boxer named Teofilo Stevenson. Does anybody remember that name, Teo Stevenson? Yes. He won 3 gold medals in heavyweight division in 3 successive Olympics. And I was interested in Cuba and wanted to do a book down there, so I kept assigning myself stories to do down there. I was editing the style section at the time, and I knew somebody who knew him, and he, back in the day, probably after he won his 1972 gold medal, he was offered $1 million, back when $1 million was $1 million, to defect from Cuba and come and fight Muhammad Ali, which is the fight that people wanted to see, because this guy Stevenson was a great boxer, and he actually looks a bit like Ali too. He similar kind of features, about the same complexion, tall, handsome guy. And he didn't, and he had plenty of opportunities to defect, but he stayed. And so I wanted to find out why. Why did you make that decision? And so that's what the story was about, and it turned out to be complicated. He had he felt that as a young black man who had grown up in Cuba, he had opportunities he never would have had without the revolution, and he felt a loyalty to Cuba, and he had, at the same time, he had open eyes about what the system had become, and it wasn't that he supported all of that, it was that, and part of it was ego. He was a hero to the nation. Anyhow, I spent some time with Teo Stevenson, which mostly consisted of him drinking rum and wanting to drive, and me having to drive as he went around Havana to visit his 16 or 17 girlfriends. I don't know how many he had. He had a lot of girlfriends. It turned out, actually, that subsequently he met Ali. Ali visited, I believe, Cuba, and that may have been where they first met. He subsequently visited Ali more than once in the States, and they became very close friends. And he always described Ali as a much greater world figure than he, as just with a reverence that I found really impressive. It's someone who had perhaps not the skills of Muhammad Ali, but certainly comparable skills, and it would have been a good fight, and who kind of had walked that walk, and thinking so much of him as a human being and as a friend, so that's my only Ali experience.
Tom, a quick story.
I guess two. One of them's in the movie when you may recall when Ali giving his speech says, "People tell me I have one of two choices. I can go in the army or I can go to jail." And he says, "No, there's a third. I could have justice." And I'd like to think he got justice. The other is not in this one, but shortly after the court ruled, he was asked, now that the court's decided that the government mistreated you and was wrong, are you going to sue the government to try to recover what you lost? And he said, no. I did what I thought was right. They did what they thought was right. And those are I think, the things that resonate most with me about Muhammad Ali.